Last week we were talking about giving a summary of the things that we've talked about, and also to make an application of these things in our daily lives. And so we were talking about how people may suffer. There were two others that we didn't get to last week. Can we go on to the next one, please? We can suffer for various reasons, and just before we quit last week, we were about to talk about the fact that we're righteous sometimes, and that's why we suffer. The fact that you are suffering does not within itself mean that you are wicked. People can suffer for various reasons. They can even suffer because they are righteous. The Bible tells us in 2 Timothy 3 and verse 12, "Yea, and all that live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution." So sometimes people suffer simply because they're righteous. You remember Anita Bryant some years ago, who was the spokeswoman for orange juice down in Florida. She was advertising it. But she stood against homosexuality. And as a result, she lost her job as the spokeswoman for the citrus industry. And she was really persecuted because of her stand against homosexuality. I don't know if you know it or not, but she was a member of the church as well. That's probably why she was so strong against it. But she suffered because of her stand against homosexuality. And today, if you stand against things like that, homosexuality or abortion or anything along that line, there are people who will castigate you in every way they can. You can suffer because you are righteous. And then we can suffer because of the volition of others. This is similar to something we'd already talked about, the fact that other people can make decisions that hurt us. Their volition sometimes leads them to do things that hurt us. Now, we're living in a wicked age in America. I don't need to tell you that. You think of the decisions that are made in America that bring suffering to us. Look at the crime picture in America. There are people who are dishonest, who steal in every way. I just learned 2 days ago that someone has used our credit card and run up a bill of nearly $1,000 using that thing. Now, we didn't lose the card, so I'm not sure how they got it, but they ran up a bill of $961, I think, altogether. They were living high off the hog on that. They'd gone down to Panama City, and they stayed a couple nights in motels that cost $300 a night. I don't live like that on that card. And another one that cost about $200 a night. And there are people all over America doing things like that, and others suffer as a result of it. People can suffer because of the decisions that other people make. You think of the moral climate in America today. The immorality of America and the attitude toward morality brings suffering to a number of other people. You think of the matter of shoplifting. That's a major problem today. Did you know that you have to pay about 15% more for the goods you buy because of shoplifting and stealing by the workers in those businesses? We pay 15% more than we should pay, but we're just paying for the losses those people have because people are stealing, shoplifting, and that type of thing. You think of the problem of abortion in America. Does anyone suffer because of abortion? Those 61 million babies that have been aborted since 1972 have suffered for it. Little innocent babies are killed, and killed horrendously. It'd make you sick to see some of the ways in which they kill those little babies. I read just a few days ago in the paper about a nurse out in Texas who had formerly been in favor of abortions until she saw one. And that changed her. She no longer is in favor of abortions. And I'm convinced that if many people in America could see those and see what they do, it'd change some of them. Now, there are people who have no morals whatsoever and not concerned about things like that. But decent people who have any standard of morality would be sickened by the things they do. And so there are many people who suffer because of all of this immorality in America. I think virtually every day I read in the newspaper about crimes that have been committed right here in Montgomery. Shootings and killings and robberies and all sorts of things every day. All of that is a part of the moral climate in America today, and many people are suffering as a result of it. We suffer financially because of such things. Take that abortion thing. We are about to run out of money in the Social Security system, we're told, about to go broke. Suppose all of those little babies, 61 million of them, had not been killed. Millions of them would now be in the workforce, paying into Social Security, but because they've been killed, they're paying into it, and others are suffering for it. And some will suffer more in the future as a result of it. So there are all sorts of consequences that come. The moral condition of our country today is bringing about a great deal of suffering. Now I want to make a statement here, and I'd like for you to write it down if you would and remember it and the application of it. And that is, never lick a moving blender. Now you think about that. When someone makes something with a blender, maybe a milkshake, or you put some fruit together and make something to drink or eat, when you get through, some of that is stuck on that blender. Let me give you some good advice. Never lick a moving blender. You imagine trying to lick that thing while it's running, and you'd make hamburger meat out of your tongue and pull it out. It just won't work. And the application is, we ought to have enough judgment not to do things that will surely bring suffering to us. Much of the suffering that we experience in America is because we have been licking a moving blender. Many of the things that are suffered are caused by people not using good judgment. Now write that down in your memory. I may mention that now and then as an application for us. Now I'd like for us to move into another section. Let's go to the next one. Now we've been talking about the reasons for suffering. Why do people suffer? And particularly we've mentioned this question, why do bad things happen to good people? Now I'd like for us to emphasize the word good in that question. Why do bad things happen to good people? We don't have any trouble believing that folks ought to suffer if they've done something wrong. If people rob a bank, they ought to suffer for it. If they kill people, they ought to suffer for it. And people with good judgment and moral standards have no trouble with murderers and people who have killed little babies, kidnapped them and killed them, ought to be punished with lives. That's taught in the patriarchal age, the Mosaic age, and the Christian age. And people who have moral standards have no trouble with people being punished that way. Now there are those today who don't have moral standards and are not concerned about such things, and they rebel against the government when they try to put people to death and things like that. You know, when Ted Bundy was put to death, there were a number of people outside that prison down in Florida protesting the fact that he was being put to death. But he had killed a large number of young women. And so there are some people who are against that. But decent people with moral standards have no problem with folks who are reprobates being punished in some way. But we have a real question, though, when you find people who are good people, according to what most people think, and suffering because they are good people. I read about a young man who was about 24 years of age, and he had terminal cancer. The doctor told him he had terminal cancer. There was nothing they could do. And someone was talking with him about it, and this person asked, why don't bad people suffer as you are suffering? And this young man said, because the Lord knows that I'm ready and they are not. Now that's a good thought, but I'm not sure that you could follow that all the way. And I think the question implies that wicked people don't suffer, but they do. Solomon said in Proverbs 13 and verse 15 that the wicked people do suffer. The way of the transgressor is hard. Wicked people do suffer. But the question before us right now is, why do good people suffer? Many times they do suffer. I want to emphasize the fact wicked people do suffer, but sometimes good people suffer as well. Now, you can go to the Bible and note a number of people who are good people but who suffered. We could spend all of our time tonight talking about all the good people who suffered in the Bible. Now, I'd like for us to pick out 4 of them and just talk with them about them briefly to emphasize the fact that good people do suffer. And the first we would mention is Job. Now, you're all familiar with his suffering. We've referred to him before. Remember that he suffered because God allowed the devil to test him, and that devil thought Job would turn against God if he had to suffer in some way. The devil said, you build a hedge about him, you're protecting him. And God said, all right, you can put him to the test, and don't touch him. And so all of his cattle and all of his animals were stolen. He was rich. He had thousands of heads of animals. And then his servants were killed by robbers. And then his children died. 10 children died just like that, all at one time in a cyclone. And the devil came into the presence of God again, and God again asked him, have you considered my servant Job? But the devil said, yes. Skin for skin, yea, all that a man hath will he give for his life. And the devil is saying, if you touch his body, him personally, then he will turn against you. God said, all right, go to it. Just don't take his life. You remember that he was afflicted with sores from the top of his head to the soles of his feet. And you remember the story. The Bible tells us that Job did not turn against God. He did not charge God foolishly. He maintained his confidence in God. There were some problems along the way, and we may have an opportunity to talk about those later. But he believed in God, trusted in God, and he knew that he was not suffering because he was a sinner. Job's case shows that good people can suffer even though they are not suffering for their sins. One can suffer for other reasons. The second person that I like to mention is Abraham. James tells us in James 2, verse 23, that he was the father of the faithful and the friend of God. Now that's a pretty good recommendation for Abraham. Father of the faithful and friend of God. But do you remember that Abraham suffered? He did, even though he was a great and good man. Now, first of all, you remember that he was told to move from where he was, go to another land, and he didn't even know where he was going. In Genesis 12, 1 and 2, God told him, get thee out of thy country, from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And Abraham had to pack up and go. He didn't know where he was going. Can you imagine Abraham coming home one day and getting the Samsonite luggage out of the closet and laying it on the bed and starting packing? And his wife, Sarai, comes in and she said, where are you going? He said, we're moving. And she said, where to? He said, I don't know. How would that go over today? But that's about the situation. Abraham had faith in God, and Hebrews 11 tells us, by faith he went out, not knowing whither he went. Abraham suffered in that. If somebody had you to move just like that, didn't tell you where you were going, you'd suffer some, wouldn't you? If you had to leave your friends, your family, your situation, there'd be suffering involved in that. There was suffering for Abraham when he had to move like that. And second, he suffered because of fear for his life. You remember when he went down into Egypt, David Hester taught about this 2 Sundays ago here in the auditorium class on Genesis. He went down into Egypt, taking his wife Sarai with him, and he was afraid that Pharaoh was going to kill him and take his wife Sarai and put her into his harem. And he was so afraid he thought he'd better tell a lie to try to save himself. So he told Pharaoh that this is my sister. Well, she was his half-sister, but it was his wife also, and he was trying to get out of being killed. Now, of course, God intervened in the thing, and did not allow that to happen. But Abraham suffered fear. Now, I've wondered if the word fair means the same thing today that it meant back then. When David was talking about it, he was saying that she was a beautiful woman, and the text tells us that she was a fair woman to look upon. Does the word fair mean anything different today? Suppose one of you ladies buys a new dress now, and you wear it this Sunday. You put it on, and you get all dolled up, and you say to your husband, "How does it look?" And he says, "Oh, fair." How would that go over? Not very well. The word fair must mean something different now. Then it meant that she was a beautiful woman. And Abraham was afraid that Pharaoh would kill him and take her, put her into his harem. So he suffered in that situation. He also suffered because of his nephew Lot. He took Lot and cared for him, and apparently it was somewhat like adopting him. At least he cared for him as if he were his own son. Now, Lot did some things that brought some suffering to Abraham. Now, if you are a father, you have children, you probably know something about that. Sometimes our children do things that bring heartache to us. Abraham suffered a good deal because of Lot and his decisions. And that day when he pitched his tent towards Sodom, I'm sure that caused great concern to Abraham. If you knew anything about Sodom, you will remember that Lot was captured by some kings, and Abraham took a number of his own family to go and rescue him. And then when God had enough of these cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, he was going to destroy them. But Abraham intervened. He was trying to get God not to destroy the cities because Lot and his family were there. Abraham suffered because of some things that Lot did. And then you remember that he suffered because his son was to be offered as a sacrifice. God told him to offer his son as a sacrifice. He'd already had to drive out Hagar, the woman by whom he had Ishmael, drive them out. And now his son Isaac is the son of promise. He's going to bless Abraham and his family through Isaac. And God tells him to go and offer him as a sacrifice. Have you wondered how old Isaac was when he was to be offered as a sacrifice? Anybody know? I don't know either. But one man said he had to be younger than 13 or older than 19, because if he'd been a teenager, it wouldn't have been much of a sacrifice for Abraham to offer him. You understand that if you've got teenagers or going to, you will understand it. But we don't know how old he was. But Abraham loved him. Don't you know it was a heart-rending decision on the part of Abraham to go to that mount and offer him as a sacrifice. But he was ready and willing to do it. Now, he may have thought that God was going to raise him from the dead, but that wouldn't remove all the sorrow involved in it. If Abraham was going to kill that boy and offer him as a sacrifice, there would still be suffering for that boy. And so no matter how you cut it, there was going to be suffering for Abraham when he offered him as a sacrifice. But he was willing to do it, and God was testing his faith. Abraham suffered in a number of ways, yet he was a great and good man, the father of the faithful, and he was, of course, a child of God in the truest sense, friend of God. And then, thirdly, look at Mary, the mother of Jesus. Have you thought about the fact that Mary suffered? Now, you know a lot of things about her, but have you thought about her suffering? Why did God choose her to be the mother of the Lord here on earth? Think about that a few minutes. She suffered in various ways. For example, in Luke chapter 1, verse 34, after the angel told her she was going to have a child, we read, "Then said Mary unto the angel, How shall this be, seeing I know not a man?" You see, she was going to have a child even though she had not known a man in the physical relationship. She knew she had not. And she knew there would be shame involved in that. People would know she had a child out of wedlock. And so there would be shame involved in that for her. People didn't know the circumstances. And then she knew uncertainty. You remember when they went to Bethlehem, Joseph and Mary went there to pay their taxes. And it was about the time for the birth of that child. They got down there, and the Holiday Inn was all booked up. So was Motel 6. That's modernizing a little bit, but that's the idea. The motels were full, if there were such. There was no room in the inn. Don't you know there was some suffering and uncertainty in her? Where are we going to stay? Suppose the baby's born tonight. Is there a hospital or emergency room nearby? Are there any midwives nearby who can help me? Think of the uncertainty that she experienced. And she ended up having to go into a barn. And the baby was born in a barn. Now suppose you ladies were in a situation like that, and the baby's born in a barn. That'd be suffering, wouldn't it? In the third place, she knew poverty. In chapter 2 of Luke, and verse 24 rather, and to offer a sacrifice according to that which is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. Now these are the sacrifices that Joseph and Mary would offer. And back in Leviticus chapter 12 and verse 8, God made arrangements for poor people. Now if they were poor, they may not be able to offer a lamb or a calf in sacrifice. And so God made arrangements for them to offer 2 pigeons or 2 turtle doves, and they are everywhere. If they could catch them, they could offer them, you see. The sacrifice for the poor. They were in poverty. Poor people. There's suffering involved in poverty. And then she had cause for worry. In verse 35 of Luke 2, you remember that Simeon the prophet said, Yea, a sword shall pierce through thy own soul also, that the thoughts of many hearts may be revealed. He said, a sword will pierce your soul. We sometimes say, a sword will pierce thy heart. Don't you know, from that time forward until Christ died on the cross, she wondered, what did that mean? Why would a sword pierce my soul? How will I suffer? Now, if you had that on your mind for all those years, you'd know what suffering was. And then when she stood at the foot of the cross and watched her son die on that cross as if he were a common criminal, and when she watched his suffering, she knew what Simeon meant. A sword shall pierce thy soul. She had a reason to suffer. She had cause for worry because of that prophecy. And she knew fear. You remember when Jesus was born, Herod had heard that a baby would be born and he would be a king. He was afraid that Jesus would become an earthly king and take his kingdom. And so he began to kill the little babies of that age. Can you imagine how that mother felt with that little baby? She'd always be afraid the baby would cry too loud or be heard, and Herod would find him and put him to death. It was on that occasion that the angel told Joseph to take Mary down into Egypt. She went down to Egypt because of fear. Now, if you've ever had real fear, you know how much suffering is involved in that. Most of us, at some time or other, have experienced fear. And then she knew desolation. She went into a foreign country. She was a refugee in a foreign country. I don't know if you've ever experienced that or not, but I have. If you've been in a foreign country, can't speak their language, and circumstances were bad, you can feel very badly. I used to go to Russia, and I helped to establish the School of Preaching, the School of Biblical Studies in Syktyvkar, Russia. We established the school to train Russian men to preach and to teach women as well. And I taught in one of the first classes taught there when it began. And then we would go back or send other preachers there to teach in those classes. We'd send 2 usually, if we could. One would teach 4 hours in the morning, the other 4 hours in the afternoon. Sometimes we had to teach morning and afternoon. I've taught both times, and that's hard. And on one occasion, I was going to go to Russia, and Darrell Beard was going to go with me to teach. He had never been to Russia. He and I had worked together in the campaign in New Zealand years before, and he was at this time preaching in Tupelo, Mississippi. We determined that we would go through St. Petersburg. We had normally fly into Moscow, then fly from there in one of those Russian planes up to Syktyvkar. But this time, because we had never been to St. Petersburg, we decided to go through St. Petersburg. We didn't know anybody in St. Petersburg, but through contacts, we contacted a member of the church there who made arrangements for us to be met at the airport and someone to take us to an apartment where we would stay with a Russian family. And so we arrived in St. Petersburg. No one was there to meet us. And we waited and waited. And as I remember, we waited 2 to 3 hours there, waiting for someone to come pick us up. No one came. I'll tell you, I was afraid. I was desolated there. Couldn't speak the language, didn't know anybody there, didn't know where to go or how to go. I'll tell you, I was afraid. But fortunately, I'd made some copies of some pages in a book for travelers that would give a sentence in Russian and also in English. And one of them said, "Take me to someone who can speak English." I showed it to a Russian, and she read the Russian sentence and then motioned for us to follow her. We went outside to try to find a cab driver who could speak English. Fortunately, he was there. He could have been on the other side of St. Petersburg, but he was there. It might have been the providence of God, I don't know, but he was there. And we could talk to him, and he could communicate with us and for us. And he contacted the people who were supposed to be there for us. I don't know what the foul-up was, but they weren't there. And he got these people to come. They took us to stay with a Russian family, and then they got us to the airport the next day. But I can tell you how Mary could have felt. We felt desolation there. We were very much afraid being there in St. Petersburg, not knowing what to do or where to go or how to go. So you can understand how Mary felt when she was in Egypt. And then she knew concern for her 12-year-old son. You remember when he was 12, the parents and Jesus and a group of people from Nazareth went to Jerusalem to worship God. And when they got ready to go back, they left, and they assumed that Jesus was in with the crowd. After they had gone a journey of a day, they found he wasn't there. And they had to go back and search for him. It was 3 days before they found him. Now, if you had a 12-year-old son or a daughter, and that child was missing, you don't know where that child was, how would you feel? Would you suffer at all? You probably wouldn't eat a bite or sleep a wink until that child was found. Think how Mary must have felt. They went back to Jerusalem and searched for him. And after 3 days, they found him in the temple, talking with the doctors of the law, the philosophers. And then they went back to Jerusalem. Can you imagine the concern she had for her son when he was missing? We've been watching some of these forensic file shows on TV, and some of them deal with a child who was missing. One of them about a little girl named Madeline who is still missing. They never found her. But it went through a long story telling about the concerns of the parents and everything that was done to try to find him. So you can understand why Mary would suffer. They went back to Nazareth. But then again, she knew anxiety. And there were many reasons for that. In John chapter 12, or 11 rather, verse 57, now both the chief priests and the Pharisees had given a commandment that if any man knew where he were, he should show it, that they might take him. She knew that these rulers of the Jews were trying to find her son to put him to death. She knew they'd put out a contract on him. That's today's language, but that's about what it was. Today, a mafia or some crime man may put out a contract on a certain person that pays somebody so many $1,000s to put him to death. Mary knew that these Jews had put out a contract on her son. Think of the suffering that she experienced in that concern. But then also, she suffered because she probably knew the loneliness of widowhood. If we have any widows here, you probably know about loneliness. Did you know that you don't read any more about Joseph, the father of Christ, after that period when Jesus was left behind in Jerusalem? That's the last time you read about him. In all probability, Joseph died after that at some point. Some years later, when Jesus was 30 and began his personal ministry, you remember where he performed his first miracle? At the wedding feast in Cana of Galilee. Mary, his mother, was there. But Joseph is not mentioned. In all probability, he had died since that time when Jesus was 12. Now that's an assumption, but it's a good assumption. And then when Jesus was hanging on the cross, his mother was there at the foot of the cross. You remember that Jesus looked down upon his mother and said, "Woman, behold thy son." And then to John, the apostle of love, he said, "Son, behold thy mother." He was making arrangements for the care of his mother after his death. If Joseph were still living, why would he have to do that? I think the implication is that Joseph had died. And Jesus was making arrangements for his mother to be cared for by John after his death. She knew the loneliness of widowhood, and she knew anxiety. In many ways, she was anxious. She knew despair. She stood there at the foot of the cross and watched her son, her own flesh and blood, the fruit of her womb, suffer and die as a common criminal. She knew despair. Have you ever seen parents who've lost a child? You ever been up close? I have. I remember a time when there was an older couple in the congregation where I was preaching, and they had a daughter, I think who was in her 50s at that time, and she was addicted to drugs. The parents took her into their home to try to help her overcome that addiction. One night after midnight, she called her son, who was married and living elsewhere, and told him that she had to have some help. She had to see a doctor. She was suffering because of her addiction, and she didn't have those drugs. Her son said, "Mom, I can't get a doctor for you tonight. There's no doctor's offices open. And go on back to bed, and in the morning I'll see if we can get you to a doctor." She went back to the room where she was staying in her parents' house, lay down across the bed, put a gun in her mouth, and pulled the trigger. I was called after that to go over to that house. I saw a father and mother suffer because their daughter had committed suicide right there in their house. I saw a mother and father who were in despair because of that. I saw a mother who suffered until she died. She would often talk to me about it and ask me, "Does my daughter have any hope?" Because she'd committed suicide. That mother suffered until the time she died. You can understand why Mary would be suffering at the foot of the cross. We often think of Mary, but we don't often think how she suffered. Why do you suppose God chose her to be the mother of our Lord here on earth? She must have been the finest of those Jewish women. She must have been the very finest. God would want somebody to raise his son properly, and Mary was chosen. Now the Catholic Church venerates Mary and worships her. Don't believe we can do that. She was a human being, And Paul said, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. I'm confident that Mary committed some sin, but she was the finest person probably in Israel, the one Jesus would be raised by and taught to obey his Father and serve his Father. So Mary suffered greatly, though she was a good person. She was not a perfect person, but she was a good person. And then there was the Apostle Paul. Now, we've often talked about Paul and the suffering that he endured. And in this study, we haven't read these verses in which Paul tells us how he suffered. But in the time remaining here, let's just read that. I want you to listen to Paul's description of his suffering. Remember, Paul was a great man. It is my judgment that Paul was the greatest of the New Testament Christians. He was a great man. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, beginning with verse 23, he says, are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more. In labors more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequent, in deaths oft. Of the Jews 5 times received I 40 stripes save one. That's 39 stripes, you know. Thrice was I beaten with rods. Once was I stoned. Thrice I suffered shipwreck. A night and a day I have been in the deep. In journeyings often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils by mine own countrymen, in perils by the heathen, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and painfulness, in watchings often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness, beside those things that are without, that which cometh upon me daily, the care of all the churches. How many of us would place ourselves next to Paul and say, which one of us has suffered the most? The only man I read about in the Bible that I believe suffered anywhere nearly as much as Paul was Job. Those 2 men really suffered. You couldn't find any better men in the Bible than Job and Paul. Sometimes good people suffer. How did he handle it? Did Paul lose his faith? Did he give up Christianity because he suffered so much? In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 16, beginning, he said, for which cause we faint not. We don't give up. We don't faint. But though our outward man perish, yet the inward man is renewed day by day. The outward man is the physical part. It's this physical part of Paul that was suffering, and he was going downhill, but the inner man was going uphill, growing stronger. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh for us a far more eternal and far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. Our light affliction. Can you believe that Paul would say these things that happened to him were light affliction? The only way he could say it is the fact that he had his eyes on heaven. Spiritual things, this eternal things are more important. Remember that song we talked about that Tana said was her mother's favorite song? Heaven will surely be worth it all. He suffered all these things, but he said heaven will surely be worth it all. While we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. Paul had his mind on the spiritual things, upon the things to come, and these things on earth were not that important. He says they are but for a moment. They lasted a lot longer than that, but compared to eternity, they are but for a moment. For we know that if our earthly house of this tabernacle were dissolved, we have a building of God, an house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. Paul was one who suffered. He suffered greatly. And yet he didn't allow those things to weaken his faith. He considered these things that he had experienced light afflictions. And I don't consider them light afflictions, personally. I would not want to be in those circumstances, personally. But he says they are light afflictions. That's compared to heaven and eternity. Well, our time is about up. I wonder if you have any comments or questions now you'd like to make. Anything? We'll pick up there the next time. I had some other things I wanted to present tonight, but we'll pick up with those the next week. I want to tell you something next week that I've never told a public audience before. I want you to be here to hear it. Be with us the next time.